Hi, we're continuing our discussion of causality and causal inference in the epidemiology of substance use disorders. Now we're going to talk about criteria that can be used to increase our confidence that an association represents some sort of a causal sequence or mechanism. There have been a number of authors who have looked at the way that research is conducted, how it's used, and how it accumulates over time to allow us to make important decisions about whether we can attribute certain causal factors to the development of a disease and whether we can evaluate programs in terms of their efficacy with confidence that the program itself is responsible for the change in a person's behavior in a causal way. Austin Hill was the first person to establish these sets of guidelines. They include the consistency of the research that shows the association, the strength of the association, its specificity, whether or not it increases with the dose of exposure to the substance or the treatment intervention, the temporal relationship or directionality that B it comes after A, the biological plausibility of the evidence, that the theory behind it makes sense, its coherence, and whether experiments have verified it over time. Merwin Susser is another epidemiologist who has looked at criteria for causation and has come up with ways of evaluating evidence in terms of the number of criteria and the types of criteria that are met in these guidelines in order to permit decisions about causal inference, whether you agree that a particular association can have a claim to be causal. You would need a time ordering of the directionality of the so-called cause and the effect, and the direction. Beyond that, you would need to reject alternative hypotheses, and that can be accomplished with other types of causal inference, like that the time order doesn't exist, or there's no consistency in the findings, or factually the theory is incompatible or incoherent. Finally, we can accept or affirm that a particular association is likely to be causal, even in the absence of some of the other criteria in terms of the strength of the association, the consistency of the findings, predictive performance, and statistical coherence. So we're going to go through some of these criteria in order to see how they apply to substance use disorders. First, temporality. This is the time ordering or directionality. Did the so-called cause, the dose of alcohol, for example, precede the effect, like an overdose in a 180-pound male drinker? If the effect follows the action of a proposed cause, that person ingested a bottle of vodka in a half an hour and became asphyxiated and died of an alcohol overdose, then we can make that assumption, at least in terms of temporality. Thunder following lightning is an association, and the question is, was the thunder caused by the lightning? Or when you put on a light switch, does the breaking or releasing of the electrical circuit, does that cause the light to come on? But just because B follows A does not in itself confirm a causal relation. You need a deeper understanding of what goes on within the black box. And part of that understanding comes from looking at dose-response relationships. Does exposure to the cause, in our case, the quantity or frequency or exposure to a particular type of psychoactive substance or the type of prevention or treatment program that people have been exposed to, is that responsible for an increase or decrease in the incidence of a substance use disorder? If there is no epidemiological basis for a conclusion based on the strength and the dose of the response, then it's unlikely that there is a causal association. In some cases, the failure to identify a cause and effect relationships connected with the strength or the dose may be compromised by the fact that there's a threshold that a particular exposure has to reach in order to have an effective dose-response relationship. But in general, most of the evidence for tobacco, alcohol, and drugs demonstrate a dose-response relationship pretty clearly. This goes for the association between heavy smoking and lung cancer and heavy smoking and heart disease. Because lung cancer has a much higher dose-response relationship, we can say with more confidence that smoking is a cause of lung cancer than of heart disease. A dose-response relationship is not relevant to all exposure disease relationships because sometimes, as I mentioned, the exposure doesn't occur above a fixed threshold, and therefore the dose-response relationship doesn't kick in. Specificity is another criterion. Is the effect of the supposed cause specific to relevant diseases? A good example here is the association between moderate drinking and a variety of health outcomes. And this is usually presented relatively consistently as a J-shaped curve. Abstainers have a high incidence of many diseases, heart diseases, cancers, and even liver cirrhosis. And heavy drinkers have even a higher incidence of these diseases. But moderate drinkers, surprisingly, have what appears to be a protective effect. And this relationship can be evaluated in terms of specificity. Is it plausible that a particular substance, like alcohol, would have effects that cut across complex diseases like cancer, heart disease, liver cirrhosis, diabetes, and operate on all of those mechanisms? And why would this be so? As it turns out, at least part of that J-shaped curve is a function of the fact that the comparison group has been abstainers. And in most of the observational research, in the absence of real experiments, abstainers have been a collection of people recruited in studies which have not controlled for their past drinking history. And abstainers include people who just don't prefer to drink, but who are otherwise healthy. They include former drinkers, ex-alcoholics, and people who have a variety of other illnesses that prevent them from drinking and make them more susceptible to all of these diseases. So when you take out from the abstainer group the people who have had all of these confounders, the J-shaped curve disappears, and moderate drinking does not seem to be specific in terms of its effect on all of these diseases. Consistency is another criterion. Is the evidence within and between studies consistent? And in the case of tobacco and lung cancer, in the case of alcohol and breast cancer, the findings are relatively consistent, not only in terms of a dose-response relationship, but also in terms of different studies leading to the same conclusions. Coherence is another way to interpret a causal relationship. Coherence can be evaluated in terms of theoretical coherence, that it's compatible with pre-existing theory, factual coherence, that it's compatible with pre-existing research and knowledge, biological coherence, compatible with current biological knowledge from other species, like in animal studies and other levels of complex organization in terms of the known mechanisms that a disease develops. And finally, statistical coherence, compatibility with a reasonable statistical model like a dose-response relationship. So coherence is another powerful guideline to judge causality. Biological coherence in particular is important because we always want to be able to explain the biological mechanisms for dependence and disease. In the case of neuroscience, we've come to an understanding of how different psychoactive substances act on neurotransmitters and brain systems in order to affect a person's feelings of euphoria and pleasure and the control that they can exert over their own behavior, which provides a plausible biological mechanisms that is coherent with other data. Finally, we have experimentation, and randomized clinical trials and observational studies with good quasi-experimental designs are ways of varying exposure to understand whether exposure contributes to the incidence and severity of a disease. Natural experiments can be important where we can't do experiments, and ultimately the summation of the experimental evidence as it comes together in meta-analyses and in systematic reviews allows us to weigh up the evidence in terms of specificity, coherence, time ordering, and all of these other factors to decide whether a particular risk factor or a particular intervention is capable of having a causal effect on an individual's substance use. So in summary, cause and effect understanding is really the highest form of scientific knowledge. And epidemiology is designed to give us a toolkit to understand whether a phenomenon can be explained by various causal factors. Most substance use disorders, as we've learned from the research, result from an interplay between the environment, an individual's genetic makeup, their physical constitution, and the agent or the substance that they're using. All of these need to be taken into account. But it's complicated. Demonstrating causality is difficult because of the long natural history of substance use disorders and the fact that it's sometimes difficult to do well-controlled, randomized clinical studies where we withhold an intervention or increase or an exposure and have a control group to compare it to.